The old stagecoach rattled into Cedar Hollow, its wheels kicking up dust in the heavy summer heat. Among the handful of weary passengers, only one woman sat silent and straight-backed, her hands clutching a worn satchel like a lifeline. Her name was May Whitlock, or at least it had been once. Now it was just a memory whispered in places she could no longer call home. May stepped down onto the cracked earth, boots scuffed, dress faded, the bruises on her ribs hidden beneath careful layers of cotton and defiance. The townsfolk barely spared her a glance, just another broken soul blown in by the wind. But one man did notice. From the edge of the dusty street, he watched her with eyes like storm clouds gathering over the prairie. A man known only as Silas Ward, a name the people of Cedar Hollow spoke with respect and fear. May didn't know it yet, but this was the place where her running would end. Not because she found safety, not because she found kindness, but because sometimes the wounded don't just survive, they carve out a life from the ashes alongside those just as broken. In Cedar Hollow, it was about to remember what it meant when two lost souls refused to be forgotten. The sun beat down mercilessly as May pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked the main street of Cedar Hollow. The buildings looked like they'd been stitched together with stubbornness and prayer. Sagging porches, crooked signs, windows smeared with dust. No one offered help. No one offered a smile. At the general store, the owner's wife muttered under her breath about strays and trouble. May ignored it. She had bigger problems. Her last coins rattled in the satchel she clutched against her side, barely enough for a stale biscuit and maybe a ride out, if anyone would have her. By sundown, her legs trembled with exhaustion. She found herself slumped against the back wall of the saloon, knees drawn to her chest, head resting on her bag. The air reeked of whiskey and sweat. Laughter and angry shouts leaked through the swinging doors. She tried to make herself small, invisible. It didn't work. Two men stumbled into the alley, boots heavy, voices louder than their empty heads. "Look what we got here," one of them slurred, tipping his hat back to leer at her. May stiffened, fingers creeping toward the shard of broken glass she kept hidden in her boot. But before she could move, a shadow fell across the alley. Long, broad-shouldered, and silent. The drunk men turned, their laughter catching in their throats. "Easy there, Silas," one muttered. "Didn't know she was, yours." Silas Ward didn't say a word. He just stared at them, the kind of stare that made men rethink their choices. Slowly, almost reverently, they backed away, muttering curses under their breath as they disappeared into the dark. May sat frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. Silas looked at her for a long moment. His face was unreadable, all harsh lines and cold eyes. Then without a word, he turned and walked away. May didn't know whether to feel relieved or more afraid. The next morning, Cedar Hollow buzzed with whispers. "Grady's girl?" "No, not Grady, Ward. That poor thing doesn't know what she's got herself into." May heard it all as she tried, and failed, to find work. No one would hire a woman without references, without a name, without a man to vouch for her. By noon, her stomach gnawed at itself, and the heat blurred her vision. She was sitting outside the livery stable, trying not to cry, when a shadow fell over her again. May squinted up. It was Silas. He didn't speak. He just extended a calloused hand toward her. May stared at it, at the scars crisscrossing his knuckles, at the promise, or threat, his silence carried. Every voice inside her screamed to run, to disappear again, but her body was too tired, and her soul even more so. So with a shaking hand, May reached up and took it. Silas didn't lead her down Main Street, didn't parade her like property. He took her around back alleys and dusty paths few traveled, toward the hills that framed the edge of town, toward the place where the forgotten went when the world no longer wanted them. The cabin appeared as a shadow first, nestled among cedar trees and stubborn scrub. Small, weathered, sturdy. Home, or something close enough to pretend. Silas stopped at the front step and turned to her. "You can stay," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel under boot heels, "until you're ready to leave." May opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. Instead, she nodded once. And for the first time in a long, long while, she wasn't running anymore. The first few days at Silas Ward's cabin passed like mist drifting across a winter field. Silent, slow, and strangely weightless. May slept in the smaller room, a cot, a single blanket, a cracked basin for washing, no lock on the door, but somehow she never feared he'd cross the threshold uninvited. Silas was a man of few words and even fewer glances. He rose before dawn each morning, his boots scuffing quietly against the old floorboards. May heard him outside, splitting wood, hauling water, mending the chicken coop with the patience of someone who knew the world could fall apart at any moment, and often did. Inside, she made herself useful. She swept the floor, washed the few dishes, tried to patch the curtains with scraps she found tucked away in a drawer. It wasn't much, but it filled the silence. Silas never thanked her. He didn't need to. One evening, as the sun sagged low over the hills, May sat on the porch steps, knees drawn up, watching the sky bruise purple and gold. Silas sat on the far side of the porch, whittling a piece of wood into something shapeless but determined. Neither spoke, but for the first time in months, maybe years, May didn't feel like silence was something she had to fight against. It simply was, like the breeze through the dry grass, like the steady creak of the porch swing in the wind. Finally, Silas set his knife and carving down and spoke. "You ain't from around here." It wasn't a question, more like a quiet acceptance. May shook her head. "No." Silas nodded once, as if that was all he needed to know. Another stretch of silence fell between them, softer this time. "You got people looking for you?" he asked, voice low. May stared at her boots, scuffed and dusty. "No one worth finding me." He didn't press, didn't offer empty comfort. Instead, he picked up his whittling again and said almost casually, "Then you're free here." The words struck deeper than he could have known. Free. She hadn't felt free since before the shouting, the fists, the locked doors. Since before her name became a weapon instead of a promise. May hugged her knees tighter to her chest and closed her eyes. The creak of Silas's knife against wood was the only sound for a long while. The next morning, the world outside wore a thin skin of frost, and May woke shivering. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals. She hurried to stoke it back to life, her fingers numb. Before long, Silas returned from wherever he vanished to at dawn. A small sack of flour over one shoulder, a tin of coffee tucked under his arm. He placed them on the table without a word. May reached for the coffee, fingers brushing the tin like it was some rare treasure. "You didn't have to," she said quietly. Silas shrugged. "Cabin runs better with two." Simple, plain, but it carved warmth into the hollow space inside her chest faster than the fire ever could. Later that day, Silas worked on repairing the fence near the southern slope. May, restless, wandered the cabin. In the corner of the main room sat a battered trunk, half buried under a moth-eaten blanket. Curiosity gnawed at her, but she knew better than to go poking around a man's private things. Still, the house didn't feel like it was filled with secrets. It felt paused, like a life interrupted mid-sentence. She turned away from the trunk and swept the floor instead, humming a broken tune she barely remembered from her childhood. When Silas returned, she met him at the door with a tin cup of strong coffee and half a smile she hadn't meant to offer. He accepted the cup, fingers brushing hers briefly. A jolt ran up her spine. Not fear, not quite, but something awake, something she had thought was long dead. That night, as a brittle wind rattled the shutters, May stood by the fire. Silas sat in the worn chair nearby, boots crossed at the ankle, his hat pulled low over his eyes. The storm outside howled like a wounded animal, and yet the cabin held its own. The wood might creak, the shutters might bang, but inside, it was safe. For the first time in a long while, May realized she didn't have to sleep with one eye open. She didn't have to hide her bruises. She didn't have to remember a name that didn't belong to her anymore. She was simply here, alive, breathing. And somehow, despite everything she'd lost, she hadn't been completely broken. Before she blew out the lamp, May glanced once more at Silas. He looked almost peaceful, the lines around his mouth softened by sleep. For a fleeting second, She wondered what it might be like to stay, to belong somewhere, not to someone, but alongside them, to build a life not from fear, but from the quiet choices made night after night, word after word left unspoken but understood. But dreams like that were dangerous, and May Whitlock wasn't sure yet if she was strong enough to dream again. Not yet, not quite, but maybe soon. Maybe. The days at the cabin blurred together like smoke on a windy day. Morning brought the low crack of Silas splitting wood. Evening brought quiet meals by the fire. Bread, beans, sometimes a sliver of dried meat. Neither spoke more than needed, but somehow the silence didn't feel empty. It felt necessary, healing. May took to walking the ridge during the afternoons. The wind up there was sharper, like it wanted to strip away whatever she still carried from her old life. Sometimes she found herself pausing at the crude wooden crosses buried among the wild grass. She never asked about them. She didn't need to. Loss was a language that didn't need translation. It was on one of those walks that she saw it. A rider, far off, just a speck against the endless plain. Watching, she froze, heart slamming against her ribs. The rider didn't approach, didn't wave, just sat there for a long moment before turning his horse and vanishing into the hills. When she returned to the cabin, Silas was already waiting on the porch. His rifle leaned against the wall within arm's reach. He didn't ask what she saw. He didn't need to. His jaw was set, harder than she'd ever seen it. "They'll come," he said simply. May wrapped her arms around herself. "Who?" He didn't answer, just said, "You stay inside if I tell you to." There was no bravado in his voice, just a hard, quiet certainty, and a promise tucked inside it like a blade hidden in cloth. She nodded. That night May couldn't sleep. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long, jittery shadows across the cabin walls. Every creak of the wood, every whistle of wind against the shutters made her flinch. She sat up in bed, clutching the worn quilt around her shoulders, listening to Silas's steady breathing from the main room. It was a strange kind of comfort that someone else's existence could anchor her when her own felt so fragile. At some point, exhaustion pulled her under, but her sleep was broken, restless, scattered with half-formed dreams of horses galloping through ash and men shouting her name like a curse. The knock came just after midnight. Sharp, deliberate, not the wind, not an accident. May bolted upright, heart hammering in her chest. Silas was already moving. She heard the scrape of his boots, the soft click of the rifle being lifted. He didn't light a lamp, didn't speak. Another knock. "Open up!" A voice thick with whiskey and arrogance slurred through the door. May pressed herself into the corner of her bed, every muscle locked tight. Silas moved to the door, calm as a man stepping out to check the weather. "You ain't welcome here," he said through the wood. A laugh outside, mean, cruel. "Don't care, Grady. We got business." May squeezed her eyes shut. She knew that voice. Sheriff Eli Burns. And he hadn't come alone. Outside, several horses stamped and snorted, agitated by the tension in the air. "You got something belongs to the judge," Burns said. "Don't make us come in and take her." May clutched the edge of the quilt tighter. This was it, the moment everything crumbled. Silas said nothing. The silence stretched thin, taut as a wire about to snap. Then, "You want something from my land," Silas said, voice low and dangerous. "You better be ready to bleed for it." A beat of stunned silence from the men outside. Then Burns snarled, "We'll see about that." The crash of boots against the door, the crack of the rifle firing once, sharp and final. May screamed despite herself, heart leaping into her throat. Outside, a man cried out, a harsh, ragged sound. Then came chaos, gunfire, shouts, the smell of smoke on the cold air. May scrambled from the bed, barefoot and shaking, peeking through the window. She saw it all, Silas moving through the darkness like a ghost. Precise, merciless. He wasn't just defending the cabin, he was defending her. And he moved like a man who had lost everything once before and would not lose again. By the time the dust settled, the ground was littered with groaning bodies. None dead, not yet, but none ready to rise and fight again. Burns was on his knees, clutching his bleeding shoulder, hatred boiling in his eyes. "You'll pay for this, Grady," he spat. Silas stood over him, rifle loose in one hand. "No," he said. "You'll ride back to town. You'll tell them she's dead. Tell them the mountains took her, and you won't come back here." "And if I do?" Silas leaned in, voice soft as falling ash. "Then you won't leave." Burns must have seen something in his eyes, something real enough to shake even a man like him. Because he stumbled to his feet, mounted his horse with trembling hands, and rode off without another word. The others followed, limping, bleeding, broken. Inside the cabin, May collapsed onto the floor, her legs giving out beneath her. Silas shut the door and bolted it. Then he knelt beside her. "You hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and unwanted. "You didn't have to," she whispered. Silas looked at her for a long moment. "I did," he said simply. "No fanfare, no demands, just truth." Outside, the mountains swallowed the last of the echoes. The night pressed close again, fierce and cold. But inside the little cabin, by the flickering fire, something stronger had taken root between them. Not love, not yet, but something sturdier. Something that might survive even the wildest storms. Maybe even the ghosts. Days bled into each other after the night of gunfire. The scars left behind weren't only on the porch rail or the cracked windows. They were under the skin. In every glance, May and Silas exchanged without words. In every silence that stretched too long before either dared to break it. Silas repaired what he could, patched the door, reset the hinges. May swept away the shattered glass, her hands steady but her heart trembling. Neither of them spoke about what had happened. It clung to the walls heavier than smoke. One afternoon, while the sun was low and pale against the mountains, May wandered down to the creek. The winter thaw had swollen the waters, rushing swift and cold over smooth stones. She knelt, cupping the icy water in her hands, splashing it over her face. When she looked up, Silas was standing a few paces away, watching, always watching, not possessive, not demanding, just making sure she was still there. "You should go back to town," he said, voice rough from disuse. She blinked. "What?" "Ride out before the sheriff thinks twice." May shook her head slowly. "No." Silas's mouth tightened. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Maybe not," she replied, rising to her feet, "but I owe myself." For once, he didn't argue. He just looked at her, and there was something in his expression, something she hadn't seen before. Not fear, not pity, hope. A thin, flickering thing, but real. That evening, May found herself wandering the edges of the property, her mind restless. The graves on the ridge called to her, silent and heavy. 2 crosses, one larger, one smaller. She knelt before them, fingers tracing the worn wood. "I never even got a grave," she whispered to no one. Her mother, her sister, the life she'd been supposed to lead, gone, scattered like dust across states and whispered half-truths. Behind her, she heard Silas approach. She didn't move. "She was 7, he said quietly, voice catching. "Lily, full of sass, more bark than bite." May closed her eyes, letting the words wrap around her. "And Annabelle," he continued, "she was the only one who could keep Lily in line." He knelt beside her, boots crunching on the frost-bitten grass. "I built that cabin for them," he said, voice low. "Built it with my hands, every nail. And when the fire took them, I didn't leave, because leaving would have been another kind of dying." May swallowed hard. "I know about that," she said softly. "Staying because it hurts less than moving." He looked at her, then really looked. "I know you do." The next day, spring crept closer. The ice along the creek cracked and ran free. Birds stitched blue lines across the sky. May scrubbed the floors until her hands ached, patched a quilt with fabric torn from old shirts, planted herbs under the window. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't obligation, it was choosing to stay. One evening, as twilight stretched long shadows across the valley, Silas sat whittling a piece of wood by the fire. May sat across from him, mending one of his shirts, her needle flashing silver in the lamplight. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. He paused, knife mid-slice. "Every day. And, and every day I don't." A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Me too." Later that night, when the fire had burned low and the stars winked sleepily through the cracked windows, May stood at the edge of the cabin door. The chill bit at her bare feet, but she didn't care. She held a single piece of paper in her hand, the last letter she had ever received. A demand, a threat, a promise of a life she would never return to. She fed it to the fire without ceremony, watched it curl and blacken and disappear. Silas watched from the chair, saying nothing, understanding everything. In the days that followed, they built something strange between them. Not a life yet, not a future, but a bridge. Each repaired fence post, each meal cooked over the crackling fire, each small word shared after long silences. A bridge, plank by plank, made of grief and stubbornness, and a fierce, aching hope neither dared name aloud. One morning, May found a package on the kitchen table, wrapped in brown paper, tied with rough twine. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a pair of boots, real ones, soft leather, worn just enough to fit. And tucked inside one boot was a note, written in a hand that looked like it hadn't held a pen in years. For the one who decided to stay. May pressed the boots to her chest, eyes burning. It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't a confession, it was something better. A beginning. The days grew longer. The air softened and the earth, still cold in its bones, began to breathe again. May moved with quiet certainty through the cabin and fields, planting seeds, repairing what winter had broken. Beside her, Silas worked too, as if the cabin, the land, even the battered porch, were pieces of something bigger they were stitching back together. Something they both needed. One morning, as May hung wet clothes on the line, she spotted a dust cloud rising from the far ridge. Riders. Her breath caught. She dropped the sheet she was pinning and ran toward the barn, where Silas was fixing the hinges on a stall door. He looked up instantly, catching the fear in her face without needing words. Riders meant trouble. Out here, no one rode fast unless they were chasing something. Or hunting. Silas wiped his hands on his trousers and grabbed the rifle from its hook. May followed him to the front porch, heart pounding. The riders came into view, 3 men, rough-looking, dust-caked, faces half hidden beneath hats and scarves. One of them, the one in the lead, raised a hand in greeting, or warning. Silas stepped forward, rifle low but ready. May stood behind him, fists clenched tight in her skirt. The lead rider pulled up just shy of the porch. "Grady," he said. His voice was sharp, too smooth. Silas didn't answer. "You've got something don't belong to you." May stiffened. Silas cocked his head slowly, cool as a snake coiling. "I don't reckon that's true," he said. The rider sneered. "You keeping her now? That runaway girl?" Behind Silas, May's spine straightened. Runaway. Property. The same words they'd thrown at her before. Not a person. A thing. Silas didn't look back at her. Didn't have to. "You boys best turn around," he said. "You can't protect her forever," the man hissed. "Judge wants his daughter back." May felt the world tilt sideways. Daughter? Her legs trembled, but she dug her heels into the porch wood and stayed still. Silas shifted his weight, the rifle rising slightly. Last warning. For a moment, it seemed the riders would push it, 3 against 1. But something in Silas's stance, something in the cold steel of his gaze, made them think better. The lead man spat into the dust. "This ain't over." Then he yanked his reins, wheeled his horse, and the 3 of them thundered back the way they came, dust curling in their wake. Silas waited until they disappeared over the ridge before lowering the rifle. May sagged against the porch post, her breath shaky. He turned to her, his face unreadable. "You all right?" She nodded, though she wasn't sure it was true. "I guess it was only a matter of time," she said, voice brittle. He stepped closer, close enough that the heat from his body pushed back against the chill seeping into her bones. "They think they can scare us off," he said quietly, "but they don't know you." May blinked back the sting in her eyes. "They don't know you either," she whispered. That night, The wind howled through the canyons, rattling the shutters. May sat by the fire, sewing patches onto an old blanket. Silas sat nearby, sharpening his knife in long, slow strokes. The silence between them was different now. Not heavy, not brittle. It was full of decisions made and roads already chosen. "They'll come back," she said after a long while. Silas nodded without looking up. "Let them." She watched the fire dance, felt the weight of the risks settle on her shoulders. "They won't stop at words next time," she whispered. "I know." He set the knife down, turned toward her fully. "You don't have to stay, May." Her hand stilled on the fabric. "I know. You could ride east, disappear again." She looked at him, the scar on his jaw catching the firelight. "And leave this?" Silas held her gaze. "You don't owe me anything." She set down the blanket carefully, stood, and crossed the small room until she was standing right in front of him. She placed her hand flat against his chest, feeling the steady drum of his heart beneath her palm. "I'm not staying for what I owe," she said. "I'm staying for what I choose." He closed his hand over hers, rough fingers trembling just slightly. "Then we stand together," he said. "Together," she echoed, her voice steady now. The next morning, May found Silas outside stringing new barbed wire along the fence line. A fresh shotgun leaned against the porch. Extra supplies were stacked by the barn. He was preparing, not just to survive, but to stay. May saddled the mare, checking the cinch twice before riding out. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was riding into town to find the supplies they would need. Because this was her home now. Not the town that spat her out. Not the past that branded her. Here, beside the man who had offered her not rescue, not salvation, but space. Space to heal. Space to be. And for the first time in a long, long while, she realized she wasn't afraid of being found anymore. She was ready to be seen. The storm came just after sunset. The wind howled through Bitter Creek like a living thing, rattling shutters, bending trees, sweeping dust and leaves into spirals that clawed at the cabin. May stood at the window, her heart hammering as she watched distant torchlights snake down the ridge. They were coming. This time there would be no warnings, no second chances. Silas checked the rifle, loading each cartridge with steady hands. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. May slipped the shotgun into her hands, feeling its weight settle into her bones like truth. The fire cracked in the hearth. The dog whined once, then went silent. Silas stepped beside her. "You don't have to fight," he said, voice low. May met his gaze, fierce and certain. "I fought to survive alone," she whispered. "Now I'll fight for home." A small, almost broken smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Together, then." The first rock shattered the kitchen window. May ducked instinctively, heart leaping to her throat. Silas moved fast, bracing against the door as it buckled under pounding fists. Through the cracks, she could hear shouting. Orders barked, threats spat. "You can't keep her, Grady. Hand her over and no one gets hurt." May gripped the shotgun tighter, breath coming in shallow gasps. She wasn't a thing to be handed over. She wasn't a prize to be claimed. Not anymore. Silas turned his head just slightly. "When the door breaks," he said, voice calm, "you take the back. Find cover." "I'm not running," she snapped. He smiled grimly. "Not running. Flanking." May nodded once, sharp and sure. The door burst open with a crash of splintering wood. Silas fired first. One clean shot that dropped the first man like a sack of grain. May slipped out the back, circling wide through the brush, heart pounding, pulse deafening in her ears. She caught sight of them. 5, maybe 6 men, closing in on the cabin. One carried a rope. Another had a branding iron still glowing from fire. Her stomach twisted in fury. She lifted the shotgun, aimed carefully, and pulled the trigger. The man with the rope screamed and fell, clutching his leg. The others scattered in confusion. Gunfire cracked again from the cabin, Silas holding them back with grim precision. May moved like a shadow, flanking the attackers, forcing them into confusion. She wasn't a lost girl anymore. She was a storm. She was fire. She was every inch the fighter the world had tried to break. When the dust settled, 4 men lay moaning in the dirt. The others fled back into the night, their threats trailing into the wind like smoke. May lowered the shotgun, breathing hard. Silas stepped out onto the ruined porch, rifle still at the ready. He caught her eye, searching, scanning. When he saw she was safe, some of the tension bled from his shoulders. "You all right?" he called. She nodded, voice too hoarse to answer. Together they moved through the wreckage, gathering weapons, tying the wounded men's hands, preparing for whatever came next. Sheriff Burns might come back. The judge might send more. But tonight they had won. Later, as the fire burned low and the world outside fell silent, May sat cross-legged on the floor, patching the rip in Silas's sleeve. He watched her from the rocking chair, bruised, bleeding from a cut at his temple, but alive. They didn't speak for a long time. There was no need. When she finished sewing, she set the shirt aside and crossed the room to him. Slowly, she knelt in front of his chair. Silas looked down at her, wary. Not because he feared her, but because he feared his own hope. May reached out, took his rough, scarred hand in hers. "You saved me," she said. He shook his head. "You saved yourself." Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Maybe, but you stayed." He swallowed hard. "I didn't want to lose you too." May smiled, a real smile, shaky and radiant. "Then don't." Silas leaned forward slowly, almost trembling, and touched his forehead to hers. A simple touch, a promise. No grand declarations, no polished vows. Just two broken souls choosing each other without armor, without lies. Choosing to stay, choosing to build something new. By spring, the cabin had changed. The windows were repaired. The porch was rebuilt stronger. The hearth burned every night. A garden grew behind the house, stubborn and wild, filled with herbs and beans and sunflowers that stretched greedy toward the sky. The town still whispered, still pointed, but May didn't care. Neither did Silas. Their home wasn't made of wood or stone. It was made of second chances, of battles fought side by side, of silences filled with trust, not fear. Sometimes May caught Silas looking at her when he thought she wasn't watching, a look so full of quiet wonder it stole her breath. And sometimes she looked at him and saw the man who had once lost everything but had found the courage to love again. One evening, as they watched the sunset spill gold across the hills, Silas slipped a small carved ring into her hand. No ceremony, no speeches, just a simple gesture, a silent question. May closed her fingers around it, heart thundering, and without words she answered, yes. Yes to the home they'd built, yes to the love they'd chosen, yes to the life that no storm, no lawman, no past could ever steal again. Sometimes life begins again, even without a name, a past, or a piece of paper. If you've ever had a moment where you stood back up when no one expected you to, or if someone once became your home without asking for anything in return, share your story in the comments below, because sometimes the quietest stories build the strongest bonds.